Hello, it's Father Vogel. We continue our series on St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life. We are finishing in this video part 4 of his book. We've been looking at the different temptations, and in the most recent chapters we've been looking at the difference between the consolations that God will give, as well as the kind of desolations, the feelings that, that God is far away from us. And so in this final chapter, he wants to give an example of this kind of movement that sometimes occurs, that we can be experiencing consolations and then suddenly we experience desolation. And he's going to use, he says, an interesting incident from the life of St. Bernard of Clairvaux. He says, almost all beginners in the service of God are still inexperienced and in the ups and downs of spiritual life. And so this is true the first time that one experiences maybe some examples of these kind of desolations. Someone might not be prepared for it and kind of be thrown off as to what it is really all about. He says, when they lose the feeling of sensible devotion and the pleasant light which invites them to hasten on their way to God, they at once feel weary, they become discouraged and grow sad in heart. Very much we'll all experience this at one time or another. So he gives the example from the life of St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And in this example specifically, he's referring to a man named Geoffrey of Péronne, who was traveling with a group of St. Bernard. Geoffrey had recently dedicated himself to the service of God. He suddenly experienced a state of spiritual dryness, being deprived of consolation and flooded by interior darkness. He began to think of his worldly friends, relatives, and the wealth he had just renounced. Consequently, he was assailed by so violent a temptation that he could not hide his feelings. One of his close friends noticed this. He took him aside tactfully and asked him gently, "What has happened, Geoffrey? Why are you so unusually preoccupied and sad?" Then Geoffrey answered with a deep sigh, "My brother, I shall never be happy again." So this Geoffrey of Péronne had just recently joined the Cistercians that St. Bernard had founded, and he was thinking back, and he'd just overcome him this kind of desolation, this kind of experience as to, what have I done? I have turned away from all these pleasant things that I used to be able to enjoy. And there was this deep sadness that he had never experienced before, and it really kind of shook him very deeply. So his companion quickly told St. Bernard what was going on, and so St. Francis continues the story. He says, St. Bernard entered a nearby church and offered prayer to God for him. Meanwhile, Geoffrey, overwhelmed by sadness, laid his head upon a stone and fell asleep. So exhausted was he. After some time, both stood up, the one from prayer, having attained the favor he had asked for, the other from sleep. As Geoffrey was now smiling and peaceful, his dear friend was amazed at so great and sudden a change. Geoffrey replied to him, "A short while ago I told you that I shall never be happy again. Now I assure you that I shall never be sad again." Such was the happy outcome of the temptation faced by this devout person. And so this Geoffrey of Péronne, he's actually considered to be a blessed in the church. He would become a Cistercian prior. And so we have this wonderful example of his first time of experiencing this kind of really stark desolation in his life. And through the prayers and intercession of St. Bernard, God drew him out again. So St. Francis says, Dear Philothea, take note of the following. So we have some lessons to learn from this. So number 1, he says, God usually gives a foretaste of heavenly delights to those who begin to serve him. This is to withdraw them from worldly pleasures and encourage them in the search for divine love. So the initial consolations that one receives as we're beginning to follow God in a greater way are there purposely to draw us away from the deceitful pleasures of the world. So then he said, second point, nevertheless, this loving God in his wise design takes from us the milk and honey of consolations. This is to wean us so that we may learn to eat the dry but more solid bread of a vigorous devotion, practice as it is tested in the midst of distastes and temptations. So even though God's going to start us out with these very pleasant experiences of him, we have to grow to learn to love God even in the midst of the difficulties. And so he will allow some of these to be taken away, some of these consolations, so that we can be strengthened in following the Lord. He continues, the third point. He says, very great storms sometimes arise in the midst of dryness and desolation. Then we must fight steadily against temptations, because they are not from God, but we must bear patiently with the feelings of dryness, as God has ordained them for our training. So, yes, sometimes it can be very great temptations or dryness or periods of not feeling God. He can allow his consolations to be removed, and for us to fight temptations, even though the temptations are not directly from God. I mean, God doesn't, he's not purposely trying to get us to sin or anything like that. It's always the enemy who tries to do that. But God can take away consolations to allow us to really express love, not just love of the good feelings, but of himself. Fourth point, he says, we must never lose courage in the midst of interior troubles. During the night, we must wait for the light. Similarly, during the finest spiritual weather that we have, in the days of happiness, we must be mindful of unhappiness. We ought to hope in the midst of trials and fear in the midst of prosperity. In either situation, we must remain humble. So, regardless of whether it is good weather or poor weather within our spiritual life, God says that we want to keep our eyes on him, keep our eyes on Jesus. A fifth lesson, he says, it is very good remedy to make known our trouble to some spiritual friend who can comfort us. So this is precisely what Jeffrey, he speaks to his friend, who then speaks to Bernard. So through their intercession, he's able to God brings Jeffrey out of that place of desolation. In the midst of this, he says, our good God and the devil have contrary aims. By these trials, God wants to lead us to a great purity of heart, a total renunciation of our self-interest, but the devil strives to make use of these trials to lead us to discouragement and make us go back to sensual pleasures. So that's part of our discernment in this, is that God has good ends, but the devil wants to discourage us. So the feelings of discouragement are not coming from God, they're coming from the enemy. Whereas we want to be reminded that even though we may not feel his consolations at this point, God does indeed desire our faithfulness even in these times. He says sometimes there can be this connection between the physical state of ours and also the spiritual. He says sometimes the feelings of distaste, desolation, and dryness arise from physical indisposition. Due to excess in staying awake to pray and working and fasting, we find ourselves overcome by weariness, drowsiness, heaviness, and such infirmities. So sometimes we might be feeling this kind of spiritual desolation partly because we're not really taking care of ourselves physically. So he mentions, it might be the fact that we've been working so much. Not only have we not been praying as much as we should, but we also haven't been sleeping as well as we ought to. So he says on such occasions, the remedy is to refresh the body by some kind of suitable recreation and relaxation. St. Francis of Assisi, he says, made it a rule for his religious to work with such meditation as to not weigh down the fervor of the spirit. So, as human beings, we can't spend, every waking moment praying, because that's going to get very burdensome upon us. But we have to take breaks. And it's good to relax, as we had a previous chapter that he reflected upon proper time for recreation. So he notes, as he concludes this part, that even the greatest servants of God are subject to these shocks. Hence, those of us who may be the least must not be surprised if sometimes we also have such troubles. God bless.